you want to go ahead and open your Bibles back up to the book of Daniel, we'll be in chapter 2 for the initial part of the lesson, and then we'll kind of be jumping around after that. But our first kind of passage will be in Daniel chapter 2 this evening. I do ask your forgiveness on the fact of my tardiness. I can't seem to figure out how far away this place is, because the first time I left to get here, I left about, I think, like an hour early. I was like, I'm never going to be late the first day. And I think I got here somehow 45 minutes early, and nobody was here. And I sat in the parking lot Sunday morning for like 20 minutes before somebody showed up. And so I was like, all right, maybe a little bit early. And then there's been times I've left 40 minutes early, and somehow I'm here, and it seems like 35 minutes early. And trust me, I'm not driving recklessly to get here. But then today was just one of those days I was just enjoying the nice drive out here in the cornfields. And then sure enough, you just happen to glance at the clock, and it's, uh-oh, I'm late. And so, yeah, time, there's the chime. This is Central Time, right? So, it is good to be back with you this evening, and I'm excited to study another portion of God's Word. So we mentioned it briefly this morning, the fact of, we talked about a God who delivers his people and who delivers us and the manner in which he delivers us. This evening, we're going to talk a little bit more about the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom that God who delivers us, what he has brought in that kingdom. And if you look in Daniel chapter 2, this is the story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And he has this dream of a great statue, and I briefly mentioned it this morning with the head of gold and the arms and the chest of silver, and then the abdomen and the thighs of bronze, and then the shins and the feet of iron, and then iron mixed with clay in the feet specifically. And we talked a little bit about that and how Babylon was the head of gold, and how God had blessed Nebuchadnezzar to have great wealth and great power and great success in that kingdom. But the latter part of his dream talks about some other things besides just those kingdoms. And so I kind of want to take a look at it this morning. So this evening, I should say. So looking at verse 31 of Daniel chapter 2, let's read a few verses there. So I guess I should briefly say, it's kind of an interesting story in the sense that unlike other dream interpretations like Joseph did with Pharaoh, the way Nebuchadnezzar tests these soothsayers and the wise men is to basically say, I'm not going to tell you the dream, you're going to tell me what I saw, and then you're going to tell me what it means. And nobody could do that, obviously, because they were all, cheats and liars, and they didn't know anything about actually what dreams meant or anything. But Daniel was able to tell him, and that's what he's telling him here in verse 31. So that's why he's telling it in this type of way in verse 31 when he says, You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that as not to give a trace of them to be found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And then if you kind of jump over a few verses to verse 44 in chapter 2, Daniel goes into a little bit more detail on what this means, specifically the stone. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms. But it itself will endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw that stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. So Daniel relays the dream to the king, and he also tells him what it means. All right, he tells him what he saw, and he tells him what that actually means. And we could spend time talking about, hey, the head of gold and how it's Babylon, the silver chest and arms, that's the Medes and Persians, and how the bronze was the Greeks, and the iron and the clay, that was the Roman Empire. And you could talk about that all you want, right? And there is importance to that. But the truth is, the focus of the dream is not on the kingdoms. It is on the mountain. It is on the stone that becomes the eternal kingdom. And that's the kingdom that we care about. That's the kingdom that, unlike those other fours, is not relegated merely to the history books. It is something that lives and is active today. So what makes that kingdom different from the four in the dream, as well as all the other kingdoms that have been experienced from the beginning of time? Well, I think there's two main reasons that we should focus on. And the first one is the foundation of that kingdom. The foundation and the makeup. What makes it different? And the main difference that the dream tells us that makes the mountain and the stone different is its first description is that all those other elements, right, were molded into the statue, right? You mold gold into a head. You mold the arms, and you mold the chest and the belly and the thighs and the legs and the feet all into that statue. But the first thing it gives us the description of with the stone is that it is made without the hands of man. It is formed beyond man's control. So something beyond man has created it. It has been made by God. So it is not, at its very base core, a man-made kingdom, which already separates it from the rest of those kingdoms. And so that's the main important element to get to. And we could spend like a million times nitpicking on the story of like, well, what's the significance to it being a small stone versus like the others were these very opulent and very beautiful elements that, and you could take it as far as you wanted to, but the main thing is it's not from man. It's God's handiwork. It's hewn out by God, not by a man's hands. And the transition we'll get into talking about into the fact of it beginning with the stone, but then becoming a large mountain. But the important thing to note also, when he describes the way in which the kingdom of heaven is, in regards to why is it different from man, not only does man not set it up, but notice what he says when he's describing in verse 44 again, after he talks about, hey, this kingdom is going to be set up which will never be destroyed. And right after that, it says it's never going to be destroyed, and it says that kingdom will not be left for another people. So if you look at all of those kingdoms, right, the Babylon, the Greek, the Persian, the Romans, all of them, look at the passage of time and what happens to each of those kingdoms. Even if you just jump a few chapters to Daniel chapter 5, when Belshazzar sees the writing on the wall, and he asks for Daniel, hey, what does this mean? And Daniel says, hey, like, the kingdom is going to be taken from you. And literally the very night that Daniel tells him that, the kingdom is taken from him. All right, so he's having this great feast. At the time, he's being sieged by the Medes and the Persians, and they're trying to take over Babylon, but they're having this feast. They're happy-go-lucky. They're drinking out of the cups and the vessels that they stole from the temple, treating God's holy temple and the products therein as just common stuff to just drink wine out of and become intoxicated. Well, that very evening, God strips that kingdom away from him, and now it becomes Darius's, I believe. So even if you jump into verse 5, or chapter 5, the very last verse, I like how the phrasing of it just basically says, so Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. So that kind of ties in with that imagery that Daniel says in the interpretation when he says, this kingdom isn't being left for another people. All right, this kingdom isn't something that's been built up and is eventually going to be usurped and taken over. All right, this great head of gold, which was the Babylonian kingdom, right, it's just taken over by the Medes and the Persians. It's just left. After it's taken over and Darius and Cyrus and them, they come and they take over that kingdom, it's just theirs now. Babylon becomes the Mede and the Persian empires. And then time goes by, right? And everybody probably has heard stories of Alexander the Great, right? And he goes and he conquers the great Persian empire. And it becomes his, right? And he goes to greater extents than anybody had ever gone before, and it becomes his. But eventually, he dies. Things split up, things start to fracture, and eventually an even greater empire comes with the Romans, and all the way up until the time of Jesus. And they take and they amass and they gather and they collect all this power and wealth and absorb all the kingdoms that had came before them. the lands that were previously owned by previous kingdoms and different powers and entities and kings. And it becomes theirs, almost as if it was just left for them to take over. But that makes it different versus the mountain, which isn't left for someone else to come and gather and collect and to have a part of. It is something that is eternal and isn't left for another king to usurp and rule over. And that's shown in the imagery by the fact that it doesn't just smash the statue, right, and have remnants like most kingdoms, right? There's been kingdoms where, they're crushed and they're not what they once were, right? They used to be a greater power, but then they're just kind of there. They're no longer what they once were. What this imagery shows us is that this kingdom of heaven becomes so great and so powerful that it will wipe away the previous empires. The previous powers are done away with, and they're emptied out, and they are no more, and they don't stand in any comparison to this mountain. It's not even just a tiny little cobblestone on the base of the mountain. It's no more. It's blown away with the wind, and you forget that its presence was ever there. And that also shows what Daniel mentions at the very end, like, this is a trustworthy statement. This is to come. This is going to happen. And sure enough, it does, and we'll talk about Jesus kind of being the fulfillment of that. But all these things are just kind of interesting tidbits to pick up when we're thinking about, all right, what is the kingdom of heaven? When we say the word kingdom, right, the reason we say the word kingdom is we're trying to relate it to kingdoms, all right? It puts us in this category. But the difference is what? It is the permanence. It is the eternal nature of that kingdom. It is the fact that in its presence, there is no room for another king or power to dwell. It wipes out and eliminates all other possibilities for power or people to exist. Eventually, the mountain will consume the whole earth and will take over every other, false sense of power that currently dwells on it. And there's different language, and I'm not going to make you guys turn all these places, but I just think there's plenty of verses where you can see the way that they describe the kingdom of heaven being like this mountain, being something unique, being something that's never been like anything that has come before it. Jesus even says in Luke chapter 17, when they're talking about the kingdom of heaven, he says it's in the midst of you, right? It's not something that's coming and like you'll see, like everyone saw, like even when we look at the people of Israel, right? When people were at Jericho, they could see the people coming. And they're like, let's close up shop, don't let them in, hopefully the walls protect us. When Israel was being besieged and Judah was being besieged, like they saw these enemies coming. You could see these powers rising, the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire. It wasn't something where it's like, oh, they're big, they're powerful. Like, it didn't just sneak up on them. But Jesus describes it as, hey, the kingdom isn't like some big, broad army that's coming at you and all of a sudden you'll be like, oh, that's the kingdom of heaven. Jesus talks about it, it's in the midst of you, it's among you. It's different than the other kingdoms that we've seen. It's not like the Romans arising and taking over the world. It's beyond that. John 18, verse 36, another difference with the mountain versus the gold and the silver and the bronze and the clay and the iron is the fact that Jesus says it's not of this world. While it will consume and overtake and dominate this world, it isn't of this world. All right? It isn't something made by human hands. And that's why he talks about the fact in John 18, that's why my people aren't fighting. If it was of this world, if it was restricted to the confines of this world, you better believe they'd be fighting for it. But I don't have to because it's not of this world. Jesus' kingdom is beyond this world. And then there's other passages that show the uniqueness of the mountain in the ways in which, quote unquote, you gain admittance to the kingdom, right? So all these other kingdoms, right? Babylon absorbed Judah. Obviously, some people would have died, but they became enslaved, right? Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, they became enslaved and went up through the Babylonian ranks. Egypt collecting Israel, right? And they kind of become the slaves of Egypt. So these people become a part of this new kingdom and you kind of carry on. But here, for us, there is a different kind of admittance into this kingdom. It's not a matter of you had to be conquered by something or you were born into this kingdom or anything like that. Jesus gives us different descriptions. First thing he says in John 3 is that you have to be born again. To get into this kingdom, there's a rebirth that has to take place. That's unique compared to any other kingdom, to a physical kingdom. They don't ask you to be reborn, right? You play citizenship or whatever those tests are you have to do to become a citizen of a certain country, or whatever hoops you have to jump through nowadays. Those are kind of the steps. But Jesus talks about this rebirth. There's a changing that has to take place, all right, for us to be born again. What it also talks about is, how do we attain it? Well, part of the Beatitudes, persecuted, those of you who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, yours is the kingdom of heaven. That's how you gain possession of it, this battle and this fight for the sake of righteousness. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 50, flesh and blood, cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor can the perishable inherit imperishable. So, kind of weird language talking about being a part of a kingdom, and it's just constantly hitting us over the head of getting into this kingdom is not like every other kingdom. This kingdom itself is not a physical kingdom that you touch and you put your hands on. But the interesting thing is, despite the fact that we just read in Daniel about how the stone was hewn out and then it destroys and then it becomes a mountain, right? It seems like it comes after the fact of all these great kingdoms, right? Like, oh, it wasn't there before, but then, all right, let's get this mountain in here. But Jesus says in Matthew 25, it was prepared before the foundation of the world. All right? It destroyed those kingdoms. It technically, in terms of the world that we live in and experience, the kingdom came after those kingdoms, but it was prepared and it was decided to come about well before Nebuchadnezzar ascended to the throne. Well before, Alexander the Great ever was thought to possibly have a chance of existing. All right, the kingdom of heaven was decided upon and was prepared for. And one thing also, maybe the ultimate thing that separates this kingdom of heaven, is the fact that with most kingdoms, countries, whatever, in a lot of ways you put your treasures and your hopes and your dreams up within that kingdom, right? You have faith that the system that you have given yourself over to, that you pay taxes to, that you rely upon to protect you, the armies, the king, the rulers, like you put your trust and dreams and hope that will last the test of your lifetime and hopefully your children's and grandchildren's and so on. But what Jesus asks us to do is to lay up our treasures in heaven, not the kind of things that we inherit in this life from, a paycheck, or from, being a descendant of a family with a big house or a company to give us. But the treasures that we inherit in this lifetime, the characteristics, the things we learn from Christ and from God's Word, the hopes and dreams that we put into God are things that we lay up in heaven, not for a better house, not for a better job, not for better toys to play with while we're here on this earth, but we lay up our treasures in heaven. And I think it's pretty easy to see if you spend enough time looking at these kingdoms, the Babylonian kingdom, the Persian, the Greek, the Roman, everything about their culture was living it up. All right, it's pretty common. Every nation was about, let's live it up for now. Let's enjoy the great things that we have, the great power, the wealth, and all the land and things that we've accumulated, and drink it in. Even creating gods that pretty much, God of, wine, God of the harvest, like all this stuff, just saying like, hey, we want more of it. We want greater things. We want, a greater high. We need a greater high than we've already achieved. That's how their cultures were. Give me what I want. I'll indulge. I'll be satiated, and then I'll want more. And I think we can understand that because I think our culture is basically the exact same, right? Give me more. I need more. I'm no longer satisfied by what previously filled me. Now I need greater and better and tastier and more excessive things. But God asks us to lay up the pleasures, the treasures that we have, not for this life, but for heaven. And he promises that they will be safeguarded and they won't be destroyed. So that's kind of the foundation of the kingdom, right? That's the makeup. That kind of gets into the description of this stone that has been hewn out by something other than human hands, and this mountain. But I think the other main characteristic with any kingdom besides, all right, what's its baseline, what's its description of the kingdom itself and the people and what makes it up? Every kingdom is defined by its king, right? Every kingdom is defined and described by its king. every kingdom that we look at in the Bible talks about its kings pretty much. Even the ones that aren't Israel, almost the first thing they'll mention is the king at that nation. And so here, it only makes sense for us to wonder, all right, when you get this description of this mountain, and it's going to be some kingdom, well, who rules over it? Who is going to be our king? So now we're going to jump to Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1 talks to us about a coming king. Luke chapter 1 and verse 31. This is where Gabriel comes to see Mary. All right, he's just seen Elizabeth and Zacharias, and he's told them about John's coming and this forerunner that's going to be coming on behalf of the Lord and preparing the people and turning their hearts back to God. And I think it was kind of mentioned a little bit in class this morning about the divisions of the people of Israel at this time, right? They were not a unified people. There were so many different groups, all right? The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and, we don't talk about them in the Bible that much, but the Essenes and even other smaller, tiny groups that made up all these different beliefs of how things are supposed to be. And they're in the midst of this time of, the iron and clay with the Roman Empire. And in one way, the nice thing about that is the Roman Empire was in a relative state of peace at this time. They were, the considerably great world power. They were in control, and there was relative peace at this time. No kind of bombardments coming from any great power against them yet. And so it was a good time for a unifier, a voice to come out and start to unify this people. And there was also a great ability to transfer a message, because when you have this great empire there that is ruling over so many people in the world, there's a unifying voice or language, right? The Greek language would have made it easily transferable, relative to that time, as well as could be, to transfer a message. And the message of the gospel was going to be transferred in that time, which is why it was fitting for Jesus to come at this point. But kind of jumping too far ahead there, but Jesus is described in Luke chapter 1 and verse 31 when Mary is given the message by Gabriel, and this is what he says. And behold, you will conceive and in your womb and bear a son, and you shall name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end. Okay, I think we all saw plenty of keywords in there that match up with what we just saw in Daniel 2. And, I always have to pause a little bit when I'm doing these lessons, and because I think I can't be the only speaker that ever feels this way or in Bible class, but you're just somebody's already made that point, right? Somebody's already made this exact point. There's been enough speakers that somebody's done this exact same message, and so you're just do I almost just have to speed through this and be yeah, you guys know Luke 1, Daniel 2, let's go on to that. But the truth is, there's nothing bad with reminding ourselves, right? There's nothing bad with just keep saying it, because I know we talk a lot about this is the most important message, but Jesus is the most important message in the Bible. So the fact of when we get to Luke 1 or we get to Matthew chapter 1 and Luke 3 specifically, and it's going through the genealogy, and normally those were, Indiana's kind of considered, unfortunately, a flyover state. People are wrong, it's the best, but it's considered that flyover state, right? Sometimes we look at genealogies and say, oh, those are flyover verses, let's skip those. Yeah, we know Jesus is at the end. But if you think about starting in the Old Testament with the history of the people and where they've come from, and now Luke and Matthew and these men are saying hey, I just want to show you that the history of our people, what we've been waiting for since Genesis chapter 3, when God said, hey, you will bruise him on the heel, but he will bruise you on the head. This is that moment. This is what you've been waiting for. This is the man. And he came, and this is how he came. And we've been talking about this kingdom in Daniel chapter 2. All right, who's going to be this king? Who's going to bring this kingdom? And even in Luke 1, when it talks about John, he's going to be the forerunner. Now, he's not the guy, but he's coming. All right, John's going to be there, and he's going to signal the coming of this king. And now we're talking to Mary, and he's telling her he's Jesus, and he's the Son of the Most High, and he's going to be a part of this kingdom. He will have the throne of David, which relays to another prophecy, and I'm throwing a lot of stuff out here, but When David was promised, 2 Samuel chapter 7, right? The establishment of your kingdom on your throne forevermore. Back all the way to Genesis, when Jacob blesses all of his sons. And he tells Judah, the scepter will not depart from you forever. Jesus, 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 Jesus is the answer over and over and over again. Jesus is the answer to all these prophecies, all of these promises that have been made. Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3, the promise to Abraham, the promise to Judah, the promise to David. Isaiah chapter 7, going to be born of a virgin. Genesis chapter 3, born from a woman who will eventually smash the snake, right? And I'm going to jump over to and just read a little bit from Isaiah. You keep your fingers in Luke, but in Isaiah 9, I just want to read a couple of verses about this king and his kingdom that he is establishing that give us a little bit more description. In verse 6 of Isaiah 9, it says, "For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace, and on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this." Okay. Isn't that what we're waiting for? Isn't that what we want? I kind of think it's comical, but I'm not, I think I've said this like a million times. I'm not a political person. But the way that this is described, like you hear people, that are just rah-rah USA, they think this is what the United States is. It's not. All right? We wanted it to be something great. Every kingdom wants it to be the end-all, be-all. Every people that's lived in the kingdom, the Romans, they thought they were the end-all, be-all. Alexander the Great thought he was the great of the greats. And his people, those were the people. All right? Even Israel, right? Even though they were God's chosen people, the kingdom of heaven is truly what made them God's people. Not the area of Israel and of Judah and Jerusalem. There was no significance in that. All right? It's this kingdom. It's this power. It's this established king who is going to uphold justice and righteousness, which is what every kingdom should be about. Every form of government should be about preserving justice and righteousness among its peoples. And everything we see in the news from citizens of any country, it doesn't seem like there's much justice and righteousness being upheld and preserved. All right, and it's not a matter of we need to go home and look at CNN, Fox, and ABC and every news channel and just sit here and be like, oh snap, just terrible, right? It's just a matter of we need to quit looking for it in those other places. We can't find it there. We're not going to find it. And if there's a kingdom and a power that raises after the United States that's greater and more powerful, whatever, it's not going to be found there either. This is the kingdom. This is the answer. This is the justice and righteousness that we're looking to be preserved. And so that's why, it's different for us in the sense that I was given a full Bible from birth. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like we weren't given segments like my parents were like, here's Genesis and you'll earn the rest after you go through Genesis, right? Most of us we were all over the place. We were just, here's Jesus. 5 years old, here's Jesus. Imagine though, like what we read in Hebrews 11 this morning, you had to wait for him. You waited lifetime and generation after generation. And then these people are hearing in Luke chapter 1, Luke chapter 3, Matthew chapter 1 about here's the lineage. You know the history. You know Abraham. You know down to David. You know from David down to the Babylonian exile. And you know from then to now. Well, here he is. You've waited those generations after generations to get to this moment. And now your king is here. And that's how we need to somehow find a way to see this, of this coming king, of this glorious entrance that has been waited for year after year after year. And we have the blessing of knowing that it's there. The king is here. The kingdom has come. We are a part of the kingdom, and the king is on his throne. And there's great joy and beauty in that. I want to finish up with one last thing, talking about how, a kingdom is defined by its foundation and its characteristics and its values, right? And its king. And I think a common theme within a kingdom usually is that through the history of time, it is people putting themselves on the line to die and serve their king. But if you jump with me over to Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14, we have Jesus on trial. Mark chapter 14, Jesus on trial before Pilate. He's already had all of his accusers come forward, and they're telling all these stories, and none of them made the smart decision to actually convene beforehand and tell the right lies. They're all over the place, and none of them can tell the truth, obviously, but also they can't even lie correctly. Because one of them saying, no, he was at the root beer shop. No, he was over here eating this. They had no idea. They couldn't even get on the same page. And so the only way Jesus could condemn himself is if he said anything. And even though we talked about how Jesus was silent before his accusers, there are a few things he does say. And I think of all the things that Jesus says while he is on trial, I think this is the most impactful. Because verse 61, it says, he kept silent and he didn't answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? So we've been talking, who's our king? Who is this guy? And he's asking him, are you the king? Are you the Son of the Blessed One, of God? And Jesus said, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Some began to spit at him and to blindfold him and to beat him with their fists and to say to him, prophesy, and the others received him with slaps in the face. So the unique situation where most kingdoms and the history of time is, did they have that leader that they would rally upon and would die for? One of the last things that makes this kingdom unique is the fact that our story of this kingdom being built and formed and lasting forever is that it is founded not on those who are willing to die for their king, but a king who is willing to die for his people. That is what makes this ultimately the most lasting and powerful kingdom, is that Jesus Christ it isn't a story of people dying for him ultimately. It is about him dying for his people. And even people that would choose not to be a part of that kingdom. Jesus Christ dies for all of them. And it's in this moment where he says, they ask him, are you the king? And he had to answer yes. He couldn't lie. And he is. And did anybody notice the fact of what he says? You'll see see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of God. Well, did anybody notice this morning, Stephen, in his last moments, that's what he sees, right? He sees the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of God. We, in our last moments, after this life, the permanent life that we are headed to, we will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of God. No other kingdom has that lasting image. Every other kingdom in history ends in destruction and rubble. And even the kingdom of Israel, Jerusalem, when it was foretold, not one stone's going to be left on another. I've been fortunate enough to go to Israel. I showed you guys some pictures, but I can go there and you can see there wasn't one stone left on another. There is no stone left on another of the ancient city of Jerusalem. It has been torn down and demolished. Every kingdom is going to be like that and wiped away and become like it was never there. But the kingdom of heaven, the lasting image, the eternal image, is Jesus Christ at the right hand of the throne of God. And so, what makes it different? The founder, the maker is God. The king is Jesus Christ, and it lasts forever. So we are here singing, praising God because we are in the kingdom of heaven. I think that one thing that I find interesting that I love is the fact that every day I get together with every day I'm able to get together at church and worship is I find such joy and happiness in doing something I'm really not very good at. I'm not very good at singing. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't like spending a lot of my time doing stuff I'm bad at. Do any of you guys like spending a lot of time at things you're really bad at? Right? My brother was so good at basketball growing up, and he was the older brother. We were close in age. He was about 2 years old. He would destroy me in basketball. So naturally, I still like playing basketball, just not with him, right? All right, eventually you're like, can I do something that I'm good at? And then on the flip side, there'd be things I was better than him at. And he didn't like to do those things. We generally don't like to do things that we're good at. And for some reason, I love singing with brothers and sisters in Christ that I don't care about myself in the process, I don't care that I don't sing well. I didn't even think about the fact this morning, Jeff, you asked who's a bass. I think I technically am a bass, but I was like so unsure of what that actually means that I didn't have the guts to raise my hand. But I love to sing. It's about I don't know about you guys, it's the only songs I get goosebumps in. Because the message, because the truth behind the emotions that we feel is something that no other song that's about worldly, earthly things can match that, can match the truth and honesty of the gospel and the wondrous gift of Jesus Christ. And that's what we can sing about, and that emotion kind of permeates through every song that we sing. And it doesn't matter how good I am. It doesn't matter, how good each of us are. It's what we're singing for and who we're singing to praise. And it's our God who formed that kingdom before time, before the others, and he made it last forever. And it's here now, and we get to be a part of it. And that is a certain thing we should rejoice in every day. So if you want to be a part of that kingdom, or if you are a part of that kingdom and you need support and encouragement, the time is now to come forward, and we will pray with you and for you as we stand and sing this song.